Hello, good morning. My name is Lisa Skinner, and I'm the Managing Director of Digital Financial. Thank you very much for coming to this event, sponsored by the Caribbean Confederation of Credit Unions. And today we're discussing staying secure in a digital world. And next slide, please. Joining me today to lead our discussion is Paul Macon, who is someone that I like to refer to as a digital pioneer. Paul has been involved in digital financial services since the very beginning as one of the co-creators of M-Pesa in Kenya. Today, he works with standard-setting bodies, central banks, and financial institutions on matters of digital identity, digital security, payment systems, the new world of biometrics, and all sorts of other cutting-edge things. And Paul will be our moderator throughout the discussion. Next slide, please. And we have a fabulous panel of people who have worked around the world in issues of security, privacy, and consumer protection. David Medine specializes in particular in the issue of consumer protection and consumer financial services. He has a long history with the US government in moving forward on the issues of privacy, on the issues of keeping your data safe. And currently, he's interested in the creation of cybersecurity resource centers for developing countries, because this is a threat worldwide. And it is one thing in an organization of rich communities, such as the EU, to have high standards and assume everyone can meet them easily. And it is another thing in a developing nation to be faced with the fact that you're seen as a target. And this is one of the areas that Mr. Medine focuses on. We have Matt Zufelt, who was with us on our event with CCCU last week. And Matt is here to link the issues of security to the internal technology and digital channels of your financial institution. Full disclosure, Jeremy Skinner is my brother. He is a technology architect with a deep interest in architecture and governance. And he's here again to talk about the idea of best security practices, but Jeremy also has a lot of experience in managing vendor relationships. And so he will be someone who can answer questions about how do you make sure that your third-party providers, your partners, and your vendors are also secure. If they're doing things for you, if they're representing you, if they're giving you an app that you're running to meet your digital requirements, you need to know that they are also engaged in using the very best of practices. We are hoping to have Dr. Leon Perlman join us in about 25 minutes. He is unfortunately called away on an emergency issue. Dr. Perlman is a blockchain specialist at the moment, but he has started with digital financial services way back when he was designing some of the very first mobile applications. He's got a deep knowledge in the issues of national payment systems, de-risking, and telecommunications, as well as being the person to answer questions on things like digital currencies, which is a really hot topic here in the Caribbean. And coming to us from Australia, I have Dr. Louis de Coker. Dr. de Coker has a specialization in the issues around identity, particularly KYC and anti-money laundering. He focuses on advising standard-setting bodies and central banks on how to have an appropriate balance between risk and compliance responsibilities. And in particular, he's interested in the idea of collaborative due diligence and also in the issues of how to do eKYC in such a way that it is useful for financial inclusion. And he would be very interested in some of the issues that are happening in the Caribbean around the idea of some shared KYC services. All of us come from a consultancy called Digital Financial. And Digital Financial consults to governments, regulators, development organizations, and of course, financial institutions like banks and credit unions and microfinance. We're a group of senior experts who are very interested in working in a collaborative way with our partners. And we are very, very pleased to be presenting this to you today. First slide. First thing, this is not going to be a formal presentation event. We've got a couple of slides to set the ground, and then it's going to be a roundtable with Paul asking questions and hopefully with lots of questions from you, the audience. So please use the question answer format that's available here on Zoom, or put things in the chat. We have somebody monitoring both of them, and we're very interested in hearing about what have been your concerns and experiences about cybersecurity. The next point is that we're going to talk about psychology and behavior as the groundwork for understanding any form of security, including cybersecurity. And we are going to talk a bit about what's happening with standard setting bodies and regulators, what are some of the new requirements, how to be ready for them. And we're going to talk about technology and processes which protect, how to set things up within your institution, how to make people feel secure, how to make your customer know when they're in a secure transaction and when they need to be careful. And we're going to discuss what are things that are new in the issues of identity, authentication, and authorization. Next slide. So let's think about cybercrime. Next slide. Law enforcement agencies often think about this and classify it by how the technology is used, whether it is technology as a target or whether technology is simply the way that a scam that has been being run many times before is being used now. And things like email and text message have made people very, very fast to respond. And in that speed of response is a real weakness, because it's not like they are speaking to their known officer at the credit union, who is someone that would know their voice, know what's going on, and they have a trust set up right there. When people get a text message or an email, they tend to immediately act on it, and often this is a problem, both for your members and also for your staff. And I have a note here just to remind everybody that cybercrime is big business. This is not just someone sitting in their basement with their PC. This is really big business with the understanding of institutions, with the fact that they probably have, if you're going to be a target, you've been researched, there's an understanding of what the value of your data is, there's an understanding of how much you can afford to pay for ransomware. And I'm sure all of us have heard of software as a service. Well, some of the big cybercrime outfits actually give ransomware as a service, so that someone who knows your institution could actually say, hey, I think I've got something here that could make money, and they engage in a discussion and they split the proceeds with the supplier of the ransom. Paul, do you have anything on here?
Yes, just to emphasize that ransomware attacks tend to be very well researched. So the attackers generally do some gain an understanding of their targets and can be calibrating it fairly well according to your vulnerabilities and the amount that they think you can afford to pay. The second, the phishing attacks, etc., tends to be smaller scale. It can be targeted at businesses, but also to individuals, and it's a lot more random, I think. It can and it can be for attacks down to a few $100s, whereas the ransomware attacks tends to be in the millions.
Right. Next slide. Something to keep in mind when you hear all of the new words about ransomware and phishing and so on is that many of these things are updated versions of threats that financial institutions have always had. So the idea of extortion because someone can get at your data is as old as the hills. Direct monetary theft This has changed from someone intercepting your cash truck going to branches to being someone that now gets in the middle of a digital transaction, misdirects. And for your members, this has moved from the idea of direct robbery to someone using a skimmer and getting their PIN number and then going in and robbing them digitally. And even if you don't have a wide number of digital channels serving your members, there's still this issue of if you've got any form of a PIN number card to come into a branch to do a transaction, all of these things are vulnerable. And then there's data theft, which is corporate espionage, really. And it's an indirect way of making money. The data that you have on your customers, the sensitive data that you have as a financial institution, you have data that is sensitive in the way that healthcare records are sensitive. These are things that tell people everything about your members and also about your staff. And so this is useful from a monetary purpose. It can be sold on. It can be used to make fake identifications, which can be used for political reasons. And it can also simply be this game of that we have all your information and we will publish it if you don't pay us. Paul, anything?
I think it just emphasizes the fact that in terms of crime, there really is nothing new in the world. It's just different channels for the types of crime we've had for generations, hundreds of years. Every technology.
Lisa, there's also just the brute.
Sorry, Jeremy. Sorry, Paul.
Was that Jeremy speaking?
Yes, I think it was.
Yes, I was trying to indicate there's also the issue of denial of service.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which is an unusual one because in that it is essentially a new attack that we haven't seen before, because in the past there was no way that somebody could shut down an entire bank and all of its branches simply by standing outside, whereas you can actually shut down a digital bank from sitting anywhere in the world if you are prepared to put the effort in. So yes, Jeremy, you're quite right. There is something new in the world, the denial of service attack.
But maybe what's not new in the world is the old quote from bank robber Willie Sutton, which is, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is.
Yeah.
And now in the 21st century, the money is online, and that's where the bank robbers are going.
And of course, it's much lower risk. You don't have to turn up with a mask and a gun. You can just sit in your basement and run the attack from there, with a fair degree of anonymity if you know what you're doing. There is an issue around that, of course, because quite often people assume they're anonymous through the various channels they use, but a tech-savvy person can usually work out who you are. An example being Bitcoin. If you want to get money in or out to Bitcoin, then you're immediately exposing your identity. So no good criminal uses Bitcoin. They still use cash if they can.
Great. Next slide. So if you're online, as you were just saying, gentlemen, if you're online or interconnected, you are a target. And you are a target, whether it's data from health, as in the recent issue in Jamaica. You're a target if you're a big company like Sony, and they can say, we'll release your intellectual property in such a way that we take your potential to gain value from it away from you. You're a risk if you're the US Department of Defense. Everyone's at risk. Next slide.
Yes, and before we go on, there is a good question actually on the Q&A from Al Gill.
Sure.
Was it surprising to learn of the recent attack on the Colonial Pipeline in the US? It was a surprise to them, but everybody else has been talking about critical infrastructure protection for years. I think it's possibly it's possibly always been assumed by many of these corporations that the attacks are on the financial sector. And this exposed the fact that they were complacent and had not carried out their due diligence in the cybersecurity space. Everybody's exposed, and that's the key message that we wanted to convey today. It doesn't matter what sector you're in, whether you're in the financial sector, the oil sector, or whatever it may be. You are at risk. If you have money that can be extorted from you, then you're at risk.
Yes, and that ties right into this slide, Paul, because here we have some very well-known services that many institutions outsource to that have a reputation of being secure, SolarWinds of all people. And so, yes, everyone is a target, and sometimes it's an indirect target. So the financial institution or the government office might be the end goal, but it might be achieved by breaking the security of one of the suppliers.
Mm-hmm.
Paul?
Yes, I think SolarWinds came as a big shock to everyone, that somebody who was essentially, for want of a better word, an outsourcer for cybersecurity was actually a Trojan horse. And it shows the power of if somebody can get into software and they can see a route through to making money, then they will. And SolarWinds is, you could argue, a special case, because it would appear it's being used for not just extortion or to get money in various ways. It was also about state actors and espionage, etc. So well above my pay grade, that one, I think.
It's interesting though, because there have been circumstances where either healthcare providers or financial institutions have been targeted.
Absolutely. Anywhere where you, but generally where it's a healthcare provider, for example, it's some form of denial of service attack for the purposes of extortion.
Yes.
Again.
And sometimes extortion, though, of an individual who is important, whose information has now been compromised.
Yes. But one thing that is slightly frustrating is that we know there are reasonably good approaches to dealing with things like denial of service attacks. If you design it in from, right at the bottom of your network level, you can put in some controls against it. And yet there's an awful lot of people, awful lot of very credible organizations who simply don't give the priority to cybersecurity and don't put these basic defenses in. There is still a tendency, I think, to view cybersecurity as that's something that the IT department do.
I see a question coming for the round table there.
Yeah, precisely. Whose responsibility is it? And it's not the IT department's. And the IT department is always seen as a cost, or in many businesses it is. So if the head of IT comes along and says, I need more money for X, some form of cybersecurity, it will always be, oh, that's IT. They're always just asking for more money. And it's not given the priority it needs.
Next slide, please. So our point here is that psychology leads technology. And as Paul was saying, if you have a mindset that is saying, I'm going to do things in appropriate fashion to try to build in as much security as I can start right at the very beginning of the way that you design systems, the way you design channels, the way you design product, and the way you design communication. So member education, training of your staff, again, product, process, this idea of anticipating an issue. Now that we've all seen so many institutions hit, this is surprising when you get an institution such as the oil pipeline that hadn't thought about it. And so there's a really learning from others part to this. Keeping current with regulations, because regulators around the world are monitoring this, and they come up with suggestions and guidance that is really, really useful. It's not there to burden your institution, it's there to save you. And the idea of understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your technology, so that you use it appropriately. Paul?
Yeah, it's just essentially one of the lessons that you learn very early on when you start working in the cybersecurity space is that at least 50% of cybersecurity is about people. And we see an awful lot of misuse of technology. I've got the technology in place, therefore I am secure. But if you look at how people are using that technology, it's really, in some cases, it really isn't adding to the security. I'll give you one example. Many financial organizations, for example, won't let you take a laptop into their premises if they're really paranoid. If they're a little more laissez-faire, they will let you take your laptop in, but they will take down the serial number first on your way in. And the reason for that is they want to make sure that you're not swapping your laptop for one of theirs whilst you're in the offices. Only once in all my years of doing data security reviews has anyone actually checked my laptop serial number on the way out as well.
No.
So checking it on the way there, therefore, is merely security theatre. It adds no security whatsoever, apart from you know what my serial number is. But unless you check it on the way out as well, there's really no point.
Right. That's absolutely about mindset.
Yeah.
Next slide. So protecting your credit union, protecting your staff. Again, this idea, as Paul was talking about, how much human interaction and inaction matter. And so a lot of what we find is that if you don't have an ongoing staff training that you're always updating, people don't feel that they know what to do. This is the first thing that people say is, oh, I kind of noticed something was wrong, but I didn't know what to do. So do you stress paying attention? Do you stress seeing those subtle changes in emails, in screensavers, login pages? If you are rolling out a change through your institution and all of a sudden everybody's login is going to look different, do you make sure that everyone knows this so that it's not a surprise when it happens, but B, if someone sees something that is different and they haven't been informed, they understand that they should now move on that as a real security issue. And do you have a way for your staff to come to you and say, I'm suspicious of something? And is this done without judgment? Is it done without placing blame? This is really important, again, because one of the things that often happens is that an email is sent that is embarrassing, a message is given that seems like it's something that's absolutely has to be done quickly or your project's going to fail. And when someone wants to escalate that, they have to be listened to. It has to be not their fault. And when something has been caught, do you tell everybody in your institution that, look, hey, Paul was paying attention and look what he found? Because that will hugely encourage your staff to be part of your defense rather than an area of weakness. And then the last thing is, Paul, I'm going to give it to you about Chief Security Officer and the independence.
Yeah, I don't want my Chief Security Officer reporting to the head of IT. It's not an IT function. There's a lot of IT involved, but as we said, there's at least 50% is about people. So I want the CSO reporting to the CEO and the board, direct reports, not via head of IT. As we've said, head of IT, for better or worse, probably worse, is often ignored by the board because they're just seen as a cost center, necessary cost of doing business. Whereas a CSO directly reporting to the board and saying, if you do not do this, then the bank or the credit union will suffer a major attack, you are vulnerable to losing this many millions of dollars, then they're more likely to pay attention to that. So I think that's a really important element from this. And in terms of staff escalating security concerns, it's absolutely essential that they must have a route and not via their reporting line. So we've seen lots of cases over the years where, for example, I can think of one relatively recently where a senior member of the financial department, the finance department, was creating new customer accounts and noting them down as having a certain balance. He did this for a few thousand new customers on a Friday afternoon. And then these customers withdrew all the cash over the weekend, but there was never any cash put in the first place. And the junior staff would have seen that, but they didn't have a means of reporting because he was their reporting path. So again, just to emphasize again, the staff reporting route can't be via their line manager.
If I might add something to this, Paul, I've seen the same sort of scenario in the Caribbean where phishing emails started coming in and nobody knew where to report it to. And then all of a sudden you have this 4 or 5 separate threads of people holding, you know, not knowing where to go. So having a kind of a clear sort of escalation path that is communicated is critical, because then it certainly shortens your time to address the issue, because if there's 5 or 6 things going on simultaneously, you're not going to solve it as quick and you're going to spread people out across multiple paths. So yes, just having something
Absolutely.
clear, simple is a huge benefit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I chime in on an idea about that, which is an insurance company that I know of did something very, very smart. Right in their staff email, one of the options was that I don't know what this email is for or about, report it. And without even opening the email, click a button, the email is secured, firewalled, and it is reported to security. And it can even be reported anonymously in terms of you're not saying that this is from this particular staff member, you're simply giving the information of where and when the email came into the institution system. Next slide. And I see we've got lots of questions coming in for our Q&A. That's fabulous. So now thinking about your members, and especially these days when so many things have moved into the digital realm in order to deal with the problems from COVID, you've got people who are not used to doing digital transactions. People are signing on for the very first time to do internet banking. Your institution may have been for the very first time rolling out some of these digital channels, such as an app on someone's phone. And are you clear and consistent with your members about how you're going to contact them? You're not going to send them a chat message. That there's not going to be suddenly on their application a click here because otherwise your account is going to be suspended. Do you make this clear? And again, we're about this path to reporting. Is there a simple and easy way? The other day I was on the website of a major international bank, and I kind of know what I'm doing. And it took me about 4 minutes to find out how I would let them know that I had been contacted by someone that I was sure wasn't them. And even then, it was just send this email, and you send it out into the ether. I didn't even get back and your email's been received. So there needs to be a very clear path, and that frontline person who first deals with your member who's feeling that something is wrong, that person needs to be well trained. They need to be able to listen to what the person is telling them, not assume that they know what kind of contact has happened. And they need to be able to make your member feel that something is going to be done, and that they have done, once again, the right thing by coming to you. The other thing that I keep seeing is issues like the bank or a credit union, or in this case, an insurance company, would put a note that says, you, the member, will be well supported by the institution as long as you have done all the things that you're supposed to do about security. And I think Mr. Medine will have some things to say about this in our Q&A, which is, that's a useless discussion if what you gave your customer was 500 words of what their obligations are. So I think it's very important to
500 words on a good day.
On a good day, yes.
500
Exactly.
lines. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, but you can do a lot of this with good design. So just go back. With the move to mobile banking and the mobile apps for access to financial services, you can make it much easier for people. For example, just recently, I suffered an attack of sorts, in that I was getting notifications of transactions that were nothing to do with what I was doing. So first off, I want to get notifications from my bank when unusual transactions are happening. And secondly, I want the means to switch off that account the moment I choose to. So a particular app I was using for one of my banks, yeah, I'm in the financial sector. I have lots of accounts because I try things out. Then I was immediately able to just switch off transactions for that account. And yes, I lost some money because I didn't react instantly. It took me half an hour or so. But because I'd done that, the bank could not say that I hadn't been diligent, and they actually repaid me. So I didn't lose any money, but the bank did, and they sought to prosecute the person that was doing it. So yes, good design in your financial services is key to protecting not just your members, but their customers.
Next slide, please. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
You want to keep your institution safe, but you need to innovate. Paul.
Yes, but it's about trust as well. You want your customers, the end customers, to trust you. And unless you get the security piece right, then there's no point producing a load of innovation which simply exposes the customers to more and more risk. So you have to get those foundations right of the cybersecurity. So making sure that it's right for people. You've got the technology in place, and the bit that links it all together, which we haven't really discussed, is the processes, the business processes, which brings the whole thing together. But as we say, without those, then innovation badly executed through poor security is only going to damage your reputation, and therefore it's a fruitless exercise.
Yes, that point about reputation is very important. You know, even if the problem came because of someone who's providing you the service or technology, in the end, it is your credit union that people are going to remember.
Yeah, and if there's one thing I really want from my financial service provider, it's that they don't give my money to other people. We can talk about value-added services on top of that, but keep my money safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Your money and your personal information.
Yep.
Next slide. So here's some of the things that we are going to talk about in our roundtable. And there are things that we've touched on all the way in this brief presentation. And so I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, and instead I'm going to move right forward into our question and answer. And Paul, I see that we've got some questions in the Q&A also. That's great. Next slide, please.
Yep. Okay.
Here we go.
Thank you, Lisa. So I think in that introduction, we've demonstrated that cybersecurity is a hugely complex area. It's not just about technology, your computers, your networks, your mobile phones. There are also aspects of consumer protection, the data protection and privacy, which is climbing up the agenda every day. There's the people in your organization, and there's physical security as well. So as I mentioned, people checking the laptop serial numbers, for example. We can only touch the surface of this today, but I think we've assembled a panel of international experts that are more than equal to the challenge. So I'll start by asking a question perhaps to Louis. One of the questions that's coming up repeatedly is around KYC. And perhaps can you start with some definitions in that space? What is KYC? How does it differ from identification, verification? And what about the services based on KYC, such as shared KYC?
Thank you, Paul. KYC, know your customer, is a concept that's entrenched in business and often very misunderstood globally. It is a concept that seems to have had its roots in America, spilled over into the Financial Action Task Force standards in the 1990s. But in 2003, FATF moved away from KYC language and adopted customer identification and verification. But still, the KYC continued to be used by the business community. FATF adopted customer due diligence, CDD. And for long, there's reigned chaos about precisely what is what. At the heart of KYC lies customer identification and verification. And then in addition to that, in customer due diligence, there's, for instance, customer profiling that also requires data, sometimes further data to be collected and analyzed, and a risk profile of the customer to be drawn. So it's kind of an understanding of the customer and ensuring that you know who you're dealing with. And then, of course, there's KYC is often used by credit providers and credit unions that also includes credit risk rating, but that's not part of the FATF concept around this. So it's good to clear the decks a bit. And I think what we normally speak about and should focus on for clarity is customer identification and verification. And that is where we've seen the emergence of utilities or shared services. We've seen some successful projects. We've seen some unsuccessful pilots, because it's not the easiest thing to pull off. What it means is instead of every institution collecting data from a customer and verifying the identity of the customer, that institutions or industries start working together, pooling the data so that when the customer approaches a second institution, there's already data on record and data that the second institution can use or can use as a core with minimal verification. But that requires institutions that form part of the scheme to rely on each other and on the quality of processes followed by each other, and that's difficult. It also requires institutions to have some alignment in their customer identification and verification processes. They should all be asking the same data. If that's not the case, then what's ever held centrally or what's shared is not as useful for everyone. And as a result, some of the bigger projects, such as one attempted in Singapore, failed because they just tried to include too many institutions that were too varied in their processes. And the business model just didn't work. But on a smaller scale, it can work. And we've specifically found that it can especially work well when there's regulatory approval and support for that model. And that lifts some of the burden around regulatory and compliance liability that may follow when the inevitable weakness or vulnerability occurs. So that is a very brief, broad introduction.
Thanks, but one thing I was meaning to ask you, Louis, is how does that process relate to staff as well, or does it? Do you need an ID&V process or a KYC process for your staff? And if so, in what roles, what kind of roles?
Well, KYE, know your employee, absolutely. And they're a far more thorough process because employees are the ones that you trust with aspects of your business. And you would want to know who you're entrusting your business and your customers and your data and your processes to. So absolutely. And from a security perspective, yes, it's become increasingly important. You've spoken in the presentation, Lisa, about the importance of training of employees and of members, absolutely. But with that also comes ensuring integrity levels of employees, ensuring that you do appropriate vetting, because unfortunately, they have access to systems, they do pose a vulnerability, and without appropriate vetting systems, you are not managing that vulnerability appropriately.
Thank you, Louis. Moving on to a
Paul.
question that has come up multiple times with regard to home working in particular, remote working, particularly in the light of COVID. David, I wonder if I could address this question to you. How does a bank or a credit union ensure that their services are secure in the light of home working? And are there some roles that people are involved in, that people are performing, that simply are not suitable for home working, or is there no limit?
Well, I mean, I think we've had home working by necessity over the past year. I know at least in the US, if you call any financial institution, you're reaching their employees at home. But there are a number of steps that the bank should take in terms of evaluating a propriety of home work. For instance, is there a dedicated space in the person's home for using doing bank business as opposed to being next to someone, a family member who might overhear sensitive conversations about financial information? Is there appropriate security built into the devices that the person is using from home? Are they encrypted? Is it using VPN or some other device? Are the devices segregated from personal information, or do the household children get to play on the computer and maybe transfer money around the world that their parents don't know about, thinking it's more of a game than real money? So I think being cautious about essentially the devices, the connectivity, the physical situation are all critical to the reality that people do need to work at home, at least for the current situation.
Okay, well, one of the attacks that we're always worried about in the financial sector is the collaboration between somebody on the inside and somebody on the outside. And we have all sorts of strategies in the cybersecurity space to counter that, from the straightforward taking people's phones off them, to having a sealed room that you have to work in certain sensitive positions, and a range of monitoring technologies, including CCTV. All of those disappear when we go to home working. Does that mean that risk has vanished?
Quite the opposite. The risk is accentuated, and there are probably other steps too in terms of monitoring transactions by employees to make sure that they are appropriate. Again, trust only goes so far. But trust and verify can be very important.
Verify, yes.
In this context, but yeah, I think you raise an important broader point, which is the insider threat, which is people tend to think of the cyber threat as being largely external, but I think what we've learned is that there's as much of a threat internally, and sometimes it's intentional, where people are trying to steal money. And sometimes it's inadvertent when they just haven't locked the door and they haven't signed off. They haven't turned on two-factor authentication. But I think having a strong firewall doesn't guarantee you success on security. You've got to vet the employees. And you're talking about Louis, I think mentioned know your employee, which is critical, and do background checks and do security, get credit reports. To the extent that they're available on the employee, it's also a critical factor. So I think you've got to both look outside and look inside to feel comfortable in security.
You have to monitor more closely, perhaps, maybe even look at transactions, do transaction monitoring that you previously have never done, for example.
I think that's right. I think you've got to audit employees, maybe when they were sitting next to you in the office. It was a little bit easier to look over their shoulder and see what they were working on. And now we have to electronically look over people's shoulder and say, and maybe do some spot checking, follow up on customer complaints about suspicious transactions. And it's not that we don't trust employees. We're just in a situation where we have to do additional checking because they are working on remote systems. And again, even their own systems, do they have a firewall? Are they employing antivirus software? And maybe that should be something that needs to be mandated if it's acceptable. I think for institutions that can afford it, to give out devices for the employee to use only for bank business. Now I recognize that we're talking about some smaller entities in the Caribbean, and so that may not always be possible. But where it's affordable, to give out secure phones and secure laptops solely for bank business.
Thank you, David. I think moving on then, Matt, if I can address a question to you.
Sure.
We all know that quite often credit unions, banks, they want to develop a new service, roll it out as quickly as possible, but every time we come to launch it, the security team slows everything down while they do their own verification, make sure that it doesn't add any additional security risks. They add their own monitoring, etc., etc. How do I make them move faster? How do I make them agile?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I've heard that in numerous times. Oh, we would have launched Digital Initiative X, but the security team are blocking us, right? And it's a huge issue, because it's really about culture and mindset. And that's if you're doing a digital transformation, a lot of your digital initiatives, it's really, you need to make the security team your partners in the process, make them share in the success. They're not really just a control function. They're there to advise you and help you, right? And that's sort of what Jeremy Green and I did a paper on, the keys to digital transformation and success. And that culture of inclusion is critical to it. And you can't just view them as a control function. And really, I think it's also, don't just make the cybersecurity team the final step in your process to launch, because then all of a sudden they need to sort of ramp themselves up and get up to speed. Really, it's engage those teams as partners early in the process. They can help you build the right solution, right? And you mentioned earlier about, build it kind of foundationally, start with some of those pieces, and by making your cybersecurity team partners, starting early in the process to engage them, they can really help you deliver, a good solution faster. I've seen instances where the digital sort of an agile team has kind of gone around the security teams a little bit, and next thing you know, you've got a huge cyber fraud where I know one financial institution, it was double digits in the millions of people who are getting another card in this really straight through credit card opening process, and all of a sudden they had this huge hit financially, and it kills the sort of legitimacy of your digital transformation efforts. People lose confidence in your institution. So make the answer is really a culture of inclusion, and engage those partners early, and you will be much more successful and able to sort of weather the storms of cybersecurity and being more agile.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I'm aware of certain small startups, fintechs, who've launched a new service to get out there as quickly as possible, and said, we'll sort out the security later. We'll just get it launched, because nobody's going to attack us, because we've only got a few hundreds of thousands of dollars here, which promptly vanishes, because of course people are looking for people like that. So yes, I completely agree. Security from the ground up. Lisa, did you want to say something?
I was just wondering if you gentlemen could give some information and advice to smaller institutions that may not have the resources to have what we're speaking of as a security team. How do you manage that when you're not big?
Does anyone want to pick that up? Any volunteers?
Have you seen any models perhaps where
Yeah, absolutely. There
gather
absolutely are.
security,
There is a very good cybersecurity community out there, a very supportive cybersecurity community that can help you. Your team must never try and do it themselves, because I guarantee you they'll get it wrong. Cybersecurity is one of the most complex subjects on the planet, short of vaccine development, which comes to mind. And there are experts out there that have developed solutions, many of them open source. You can download them and use them. Never try and fix it yourself. You rely on what experts have done, and take their advice on how you should use it. Believe me, it's a very supportive community, and it's so complex you should never try and do it yourself. I'd like to actually move on slightly to ask Jeremy, to bring Jeremy on board with this. In the lights of SolarWinds and all these ransomware attacks we've been seeing, do you have any advice for a credit union who would like to safely outsource some of its core functions?
I would recommend that a security audit or an assessment be done of the outsourcer to make sure that your risks are appropriately understood as part of the contracting phase, and that you ask them to provide you with security audit and penetration test data that supports this company's ability to do this. And these major companies, or these outsourced firms, typically understand what it is you're asking for, and they will share the data to the appropriate party. They won't share it with everyone, but for example, if you have a trusted security officer or a consultant that's involved with it, they would provide information to assist in the assessment.
As a more general question, Jeremy, where does cybersecurity fit into a credit union's overall business continuity planning?
Well, I think it's a critical piece, and for the credit union, I believe anyone who has an IT shop should start with a periodic penetration test, as well as a security audit, to ensure that the risks are understood, and understanding that you're not going to be able to solve all the problems all at once. You're nibbling at the elephant here. Through continuous improvement and so on, you will gradually secure. And the other notion here is you want to be harder than your peers. You don't have to be perfect.
Yeah, quite. You just have to be good enough that they'll find an easier target. Yes, which is very cynical, but realistic as well. Louis,
can I add?
Yeah, David, please do.
Yeah, I was just wondering if I could just add to Jeremy's comment. And I think that this is a comment, I guess, directed to both the regulators and financial institutions, which is cybersecurity is an ongoing challenge, and the best way to handle it is to constantly assess and reassess risk profile. That there's no piece of software you buy off the shelf and you say, now I'm comfortable on cybersecurity. You've got to basically every 6 months or a year, or maybe even more frequently, sit down and say, okay, what are my vulnerabilities? Do I have apps that are out there? Do I have a website? Do we have, again, the COVID environment where people are working at home? Constantly say, where can I be attacked? And then figure out how to mitigate the risk of that attack. And that's, I think, a message for regulators also. And it's the approach that we've taken in the United States, is regulators, I don't think, know enough to dictate how to do cybersecurity. And even if they did, it would work for regulators usually take months and years to issue regulations, and by the time they're out, they're already out of date. So instead, the approach, I think, is risk assessment and mitigation, and repeat on a regular basis. And I think there's no comfort here, but I think it's the way to harden you, and so you can run faster than the next guy, away from the criminals, but also to protect your business, because right now in the United States, we're seeing long lines of people at gas stations because of a cyber attack on the gas infrastructure. Again, just imagine your financial institution having long lines because you had a cyber attack. And that's a very sobering concept. You don't want people withdrawing their funds from your bank because it's insecure. And so it's constantly making sure that you're taking the appropriate steps.
In that context, David, what about systemic security? If we're all interconnected and we're only as secure as the weakest link, does that mean that we should exclude weaker institutions with poor cybersecurity from the digital economy?
Well, I think maybe at some point that may be necessary, but I think it's much better to try to bring them up to speed, and have their regulator play the heavy here, and say, not worry about correspondent banks and so forth, but let the regulator say, to be part of our financial system, you have to maintain an appropriate level of security. And maybe that leads into one of the pitches we've made at CGAP, is to look at security as a national issue, and it's sometimes a regional issue. And the Caribbean is a perfect example of that, which is, why not pool our resources and have a common cybersecurity resource center where you have efficiencies of scale, where maybe one country couldn't maintain it, but if you have 3, 4, 5, 8 countries working together, you can have a really state-of-the-art facility, and which could have escalation to centers around the world of cybersecurity excellence, whether it's Singapore or Luxembourg or other places, and take advantage of those skills when things get really crazy in terms of a massive cyber attack. But I think sharing resources, this is a tremendous opportunity to use open source software, to share threat information. Honestly, from a gender perspective, we would need more women in cybersecurity, and there could be these centers could basically make hiring women a priority, and also partner with universities that have training programs to bring people into these, and not have them all flock to Silicon Valley where the highest salaries are being paid, but to have them stay at home and help strengthen the cybersecurity infrastructure that they're facing.
The gender issue is actually really important, of course, because, as we've said, more than 50% of cybersecurity is people. So we don't want all the people in cybersecurity who think the same way. We want as much diversity as possible so that we can counter as many attacks as possible. And I'm sure you'd agree with that, David.
Well, and they're also high-paying jobs, and so I think empowering women to be strong wage earners, and to send the message that they are equals. And I think it's an area where this field really could use some work in expanding it. And I think this cybersecurity relationship to universities is a perfect time to say, let's make that a priority.
Louis, if a credit union just detects a breach, if it has a problem, what are their responsibilities and where can they turn for help?
Perhaps before coming to that particular question, I'd like to follow up on this discussion. From an Australian perspective, it's interesting because women are very well positioned in cybersecurity in Australia. I think we're very lucky in that regard. Secondly, I'm fully supportive of the idea of pooled resources and an action center that David positioned. That may take a bit of time to set up where it's not yet in place. The starting point for me is sharing information. If we design the system around risk assessment and risk management, then that system is as strong as an understanding of risk. And as long as we expect of every institution to form that understanding on their own with no support from the industry, with no sharing in the industry, and with no support from the regulator and law enforcement, who often have a far more holistic view of what's happening, then we build very weak systems. So the first point is kind of building industry linkages to share the right type of information that can help each institution to strengthen its own resilience.
Yes.
And then when a breach occurs, for me, that's logically linked to that. A breach that occurs in one is not necessarily confined to that institution. The learning that is confined, the learning from that system and from that fault should not be confined to that institution alone. This should be shared, and there should be an industry perspective, and I think in the Caribbean also a regional perspective. So firstly, what you need to do will depend on national law. In Australia and in many other countries, there's data breach notification requirements in place. Where that is in place, that data breach will have to be notified. And then there are certain steps that may need to follow. If customer data has been compromised, there may be a legal or at the very least an ethical obligation to inform customers about that so that they can take individual steps and members can take individual steps in the case of unions to protect themselves from the fallout of that breach. So it's notification, it is your own systems, and that's where we have a great panel of experts to try and figure out precisely what was lost in the breach. Now that I realize is often complex, and those are continuing processes. Those are longer processes than the immediate processes that you need to take to secure your data better. So just kind of some of the general implications, I think, once a breach has been identified.
Can I add two points to Louis' comments? One is that I think there's an assumption that in the breach area, it's easy to figure out that there's been a breach, hard to figure out what to do about it. I think it's actually just the opposite in my experience, which is figuring out, was there a breach? What did they get into? What did they take? What did they manipulate? Is actually extraordinarily difficult. And sometimes you never even can figure it out. If you don't have a good audit system in your records, you'll never figure that out. And so I think the forensic investigation of a breach is really a huge challenge. And giving people 24, 48 hours to figure it out and notify their customers, I think is unrealistic. I think it should be sort of as fast as possible, but it may not be overnight because there's a lot of reviewing access files, access records, videotapes, computer logs, all that. For people who are well motivated, it takes a lot of time. The other thing I wanted to suggest on the breach notification is maybe we need to rethink breach notification to not only notifying the customer, but making the breach public. That is there's some lessons from the environmental field where companies that had environmental spills and didn't follow procedures properly, there was a public registry of environmental faults. And I wonder if there's time now to have a public registry of financial institution records so that I can shop around for financial institutions that don't have breaches, or maybe say that they're good ones because they've remedied their breaches.
Exactly.
But have it be very transparent.
Yeah, if somebody can not just have a breach, but prove that they addressed it, then maybe that's a recommendation. Matt, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I love David's point about how long it took to sort of assess what actually happened, that even building in sort of the forensic information, you're going to need the audit logs and everything else. Addressing that takes time. So really yes. You still need to make sure it's sort of built in as part of the foundation, the ability to, if there is a breach, to be able to extract the right information, because just trying to mitigate the damage is often based on how well you've built that ability to extract that forensic information. So it was a great point, because it takes time, and you've got to be able to sort of mitigate, you know, any more damage, yet you still have to have built in that information to understand what exactly happens. So I love that point.
Yes, I quite agree. Lisa, did you want to say something?
Yes, I was just saying that this idea of making it public, also very useful if it was made public for your third-party providers and application development companies, file transfer companies, all these places where we've seen a third party be a breach. This would really help financial institutions when they're trying to decide who to partner with, if they could see a track record, A, of the problems, and B, of the responses.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. David, I actually wanted to come back to you with another question. We know that there's one way of addressing the cybersecurity of a financial institution is through the use of some of the cybersecurity frameworks out there. Can you give us a brief overview of where we are with these frameworks, and what would you recommend for further consideration or evaluation?
I'm not sure I'm really the best one on this panel to address that. Again, as an American, my bias is for the NIST framework, which I know has served as the foundation for others. But I'm going to maybe kick that back to you or others on the panel, because I haven't worked on that level of technical detail.
Sure. NIST is, of course, the grandfather of pretty much all the cybersecurity frameworks out there. So unfortunately, Leon, who was supposed to be on this call but hasn't been able to make it for personal reasons, he has been developing one through his organization, and there are various efforts through AFI, and in partnership with regulators in the developing world, and also there's the FFIEC framework in America, which is actually very relevant to financial institutions as well. I think that in the absence of Leon, we would perhaps have to leave that for a later discussion, unfortunately. How about questions of usability? We know that quite often customers have problems with two-factor authentication, and staff have a range of complex sign-in requirements for access to functions. How can we make these tools, these processes, user-friendly, customer-friendly, so that we stop getting the resistance to basic security measures? Who'd like to pick that up? Perhaps Jeremy or Matt?
I can start.
Yeah,
I
Matt,
think I can remember in the early days of when they first started bringing out multi-factor authentication, and you can have the best security in the world, but if your customers can't use it, or you haven't accounted for usability, then people aren't going to use it. You're not going to have your customers access that channel. So I think you really need to make the security and security controls part of your UXD, like your user experience design. You've got to bring that in, and you've got to work on sort of that. It's really a balancing act. You have to understand sort of the degree of risk versus the degree of usability. So I think it's really a matter of the right design with the right controls. And again, it kind of goes back to your digital transformation and the inclusion of the security team. If culturally you're building that user or customer member centric design, then you need to help build that culture within your same security team, so they can, because they're the ones that understand the risk the most, right? They understand on one hand the kind of need for control, on the other hand, if you've built them in and made it an inclusive process, then they also can help you, advise you on how to best sort of balance that act.
Can you go too far there? Because I know there's one organization I work with that requires me to have not just two-factor authentication, but also a long, complex password that they insist I change every 30 days, and which is never the same again. And as a result, I don't work with them because I can never remember my password. So
No, that
too far?
yeah, sorry, that's exactly right. I mean, when you move too far to the security side of the equation, then all of a sudden you've got the best security in the world. You're never going to be defrauded, but you have no customers to be defrauded. And it's really again, yeah, it's that balancing act of and really, I think you made a great point of, it's not cybersecurity, it's not just IT. It's really like your business as well. So the business, you have to educate your business as well to understand sort of risk versus usability, and that's really it's an ongoing dialogue, because you've got to get that right balance, and the business just can't say, well, no, it's not our problem, it's IT's. It's really, this is a shared risk. You've got to balance the pros and cons. So it's really, there needs to be a dialogue, and both partners, both the business needs to be educated and about sort of cybersecurity, and your cybersecurity teams really need to be educated about the business objectives, so they can both sort of come to the table and work out a successful answer.
Sure. And I know
Paul, if you can't remember your password, just put it on a Post-it by your computer.
Absolutely. I noticed that in the chat, Alan Baker has put the famous quote. I think it's from XKCD. Through 20 years of effort, we successfully trained everyone to use passwords that are hard for humans to remember, but easy for computers to guess. It's great. I think we're coming up on time now, so I'm just going to go round each of our panelists and ask them, what is the one thing you would ask today's attendees to do immediately after this webinar, which would have a tangible effect on the security of their institution? Who shall I go to first? Jeremy.
Well, I would recommend a pen test as quickly as possible. That way we can understand what the risks are, and there'll be many, and then to address them as resources permit. The other thing I just wanted to say with all of this is, let's keep it really simple as we can, and restrict access to only that which is required, as opposed to God privileges, which all of a sudden says your only line of defense is your understanding of the employee. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. David?
Update. Make sure all of your software, your apps, your operating systems are updated. And not only just they're updated now, but that you have a regular process for updating them as the new updates come in. These updates are because they're patching security holes oftentimes.
Precisely.
And they try to their best to get the word out, particularly for critical updates, to prevent your system from being compromised. But if you're not updating, the bad guys know where the vulnerabilities are, and they just have to scan the world, and they'll find you, and they'll hack into your system where everyone else has defended their system. So, and there have been some massive negative consequences for the very simple failure to update on a regular basis. So, you may want to check out the update to make sure it won't cause problems to your system. So it may not be a simple process, but something to really pay attention to and to be very current on.
I couldn't agree more, David. I think the best advice I've seen is don't do the update the day it comes out. Wait for a week so that anybody else has any problems, and then do it. But don't delay beyond a week. It's the best thing you can do to ensure the security of your service. Matt, perhaps you'd like to pick this up?
No, I agree. It's, formalize your updating process. I mean, it's not an ad hoc thing, and make it important, because I've seen scenarios where, oh, well, because it's really hard, we haven't updated or patched our boxes for the last year, just because we have to do a full shutdown, and it's hard to schedule that in, right? It needs to be made important, so you do the effort on a frequent basis, because once you stop, putting patches in or you delay it, then you have this huge buildup of issues coming at you. So it's key.
And it must be something that is so routine that it doesn't take you a long time.
Yes.
I know of one bank I worked with that they had to schedule the updates several weeks in advance. And even then they did it over a weekend, and because there were architectural issues, which effectively meant that if anything went wrong, then the whole service went down, which says to me that you have bigger problems than cybersecurity. Business continuity is something you should also look at.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Louis, do you have anything to add?
Yes, and we haven't spent a lot of time on mobile devices and mobile security, especially in the lockdown. So let me close by saying, consider asking your employees how many of them are using their smartphones and other mobile devices to do work, access emails, and ensure that they have appropriate access control measures employed on those devices, so that if the device gets lost or hacked, that the data is secure. Yes.
And ideally introduce some remote management capability so that you can remotely kill a device if you need to. Yes, quite. Good. Completely agree. I think that's everything that we have time for today. So thank you for listening, and I'll hand it back to Lisa.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to put my 2 cents within here and put that to the idea of psychology. And if I was going to be asked one thing to do right away, it would be to set up a clear and easy communication path for my staff and for my members to say something is suspicious. And that would be the very first thing that I would recommend. I would really like to thank everybody who's been on this panel. Gentlemen, it's fantastic, especially Louis staying up late at night, Paul cutting into his, would be his end of day time. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming and staying through our event here. We will be sending out a package with some of the key slides, and we have taken note of your questions, and there's a number of things that we could help with in terms of getting you in touch with some places to get good risk frameworks. And we are, of course, we are a consulting company, and we would be absolutely delighted to come and speak with your institution or with your credit union league about the challenges of cybersecurity and of digital transformation. Thank you very much.